Hello and welcome. Good evening and welcome to Chinese Food Futures roundtable discussion with Fuchsia Dunlop, Lucas Sin, and Xiaowei Wang. My name is Wendy Fu. I am a professor here at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and it is my distinct honor to welcome everyone here this evening and introduce and moderate the discussion with our three special guests. Now, before I introduce them, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. This event was made possible by the generous support of the National Endowment of the Humanities, Emory University's Department of Russian and East Asian Languages and Cultures, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's Department of History, and SOAS University of London's Food Studies Center. I would also like to take this moment to thank Xiaowei Wang, an interdisciplinary artist working in time-based media and painting. They designed our wonderful poster and created the fabulous AI-generated Chinese food images that grace the poster and the website of ChineseFoodFeatures.com. If you'd like to learn more about their work, I am putting their website into the chat, so please take a look. Now, in terms of format, we want this conversation, we want this evening's event to be a conversation. So please add your questions to the Q&A box as they occur to you. Dr. Jacob Klein of SOAS University of London will help me keep track of your questions so that I can pose them to our guests. We have three very special guests this evening. Fuchsia Dunlop is the preeminent writer on Chinese cuisine in English. She trained as a chef at the Sichuan Higher Institute of Cuisine in the 1990s and has been researching food and culinary culture for more than 2 decades. She is the author of 6 books about Chinese cuisine, including the critically acclaimed memoir, Shark's Fin and Sichuan Pepper. More recently, her masterwork on Sichuan cooking, The Food of Sichuan, won the Fortnum and Mason Cookbook of the Year award in 2020. She makes regular appearances on radio and television. I'm sure some of you will remember her appearances on the late Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown, as well as David Chang's first season of Ugly Delicious. And she has received numerous awards from, for example, the James Beard Foundation and the International Association of Culinary Professionals. Lucas Sin is chef and co-founder of Nice Day and Jin's Kitchen. He was selected as one of Eater's Young Guns, class of 2019, and included in Forbes magazine's 30 Under 30 in 2020. He opened his first restaurant when he was 16 in an abandoned newspaper factory in his hometown of Hong Kong. If you're curious about this backstory, I would highly recommend listening to the Line podcast, episode 110 from August 25th, 2020. It's quite a good listen. Despite spending his Yale undergraduate years in the cognitive science and English departments, Lucas spent his weekends running restaurants out of his dorm known as the Y Pop-Up. He has cooked at Modernist Cuisine in Seattle, Kikunoi Honten in Kyoto, Michelin-starred kitchens in Hong Kong and New York. Now, in addition to Jinzi and Nice Day, he also curates a collaborative tasting menu exploring the narrative of Chinese culinary history in relation to other cultures of the world, which became a project known as distance dining that took place particularly during the pandemic. With Eric Z, chef of Taiwanese restaurant 886 in New York City, Lucas co-founded Shy Boys Club, an introverted Asian pop-up collective. Last but not least, Xiaowei Wang is an artist, writer, organizer, and coder. Their recent book, Blockchain Chicken Farm and Other Stories of Tech in China's Countryside, is a fascinating exploration of how new technologies are reworking rural life in contemporary China and the implications this has for both Chinese food and agriculture. They are one of the lead facilitators of Logic School, an organizing community for tech workers. Their collaborative project Float, Beijing, created air quality sensing kites to challenge censorship and was an Index Design Awards finalist. Their work has been featured in the New York Times, BBC, CNN, Vice, and elsewhere. Their most recent project, The Future of Memory, was a recipient of the Mozilla Creative Media Award. Now, to get us going, I'd like for each of our guests to begin by sharing a bit about where it is that you're coming from and what you think is the most exciting and hopeful thing or things about the future of Chinese food from where you stand. So maybe we'll start with Fuchsia and then work to Lucas and then go to Xiaowei.
Well, hello, everybody. Very lovely to be here with you all virtually. And I just wanted to start by making the point that I think we all know already, really, which is that whatever the emotional pull of notions of tradition and authenticity, they're very slippery concepts, and that cuisines are just inherently dynamic living cultures that are constantly being reinvented. And the biggest reminder for me to avoid culinary conservatism is really looking at the Chile and Sichuanese cuisine. So you have this fairly recent, in Chinese terms, American import, which has become one of the leading symbols of Sichuanese cookery. And it's a reminder of the way things are always changing. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about Chinese food futures, both within China and Chinese cuisines in China, and also in the way that Chinese cuisine is perceived internationally. So within China, on the positive side, I think that the last decades have seen, in some ways, a great revival of Chinese food and food culture after all the upheavals of the 20th century. And there have been some kind of real landmarks, like I think since The Bite of China, that great TV series that was sort of showcasing culinary traditions all over the country. There's been a growing interest in China in food as heritage and culture, and a pride in Chinese food as heritage. And with that, and along with that, there's come a sort of rise in food tourism and an interest in local products and artisanal foods. So there've been a whole lot of sort of old brands and old traditional foods that are being reinvented for modern modern sort of middle-class urban consumers, which is helping them to survive. So for example, one of the photographs in my Sichuan book is of this absolutely incredible traditional soy sauce factory by the banks of the river I think that was in Hejiang in southern Sichuan. And the factory is now marketing its very traditional soy sauces as a premium product with very excellent marketing, and this will help to ensure that these traditions survive. Also, lots of small producers all over the country are linking up with new customers through WeChat, through the internet. And again, this is helping them to build businesses. I think there's also, with the sort of growth of interest in food culture and with food tourism, a sort of interest in hyper-local cuisines and regional specialities. So I think chefs in culinary centers like Chengdu have always tried to find new recipes from the countryside and from different regions. But now, for example, in Zigong in southern Sichuan, there are advocates for a little school of Sichuanese cuisine, Yanbang Cai, the salt gang dishes, which is, from this particular region with its traditions of beef eating and chilies and salt making going back about 2,000 years. And so I think although, as with many other places, the last decades have seen increasing disappearance of many local traditions and local handicrafts, but in food in China, you really do see dazzling diversity, and that's something that doesn't seem to be disappearing. Also in the restaurant scene in China, great competition and dynamism and creativity. And just to mention a couple of interesting, actually big commercial brands, which are sort of changing, the Chinese food scene, the Xibei restaurant, which specializes in foods from the Northwest. So grassland reared sheep meat and sort of old-fashioned so-called coarse grains like millet, and the oat pastas of Shanxi are now sort of being shown off to metropolitan people all over China. And I think there's also been a huge growth in beautiful cookbooks and food writing with much higher production values. This is all very interesting. And I think too that China has such a rich, historic, sophisticated culture of gastronomy, and so many of the sort of trends and concepts and concerns that people internationally tend to associate with Californian or European cuisine, like notions of terroir, the importance of seasonal produce. So many of these things have very ancient forebears in China, And I think that there is a sort of renewed interest, particularly in the Jiangnan region, where I've spent quite a lot of time, in sort of food culture and gastronomy, and a preoccupation with finding wonderful ingredients and so on. But, you know, on the negative side, of course, environmental challenges. So some of these fine products have literally disappeared because of redevelopment and pollution. Just two examples: in Chengdu, in Mumanshan, just outside the city. This is where the Arjingtiao chilies were grown, and that's the key ingredient for the famous PCN chili bean paste. And that whole area has been redeveloped. And so it's now almost impossible to get those chilies locally. And then one of the greatest fish in Jiangnan cuisine from the Yangtze River, the shiyu, or Reeves shad, is actually pretty much disappeared from Chinese waterways and is now imported frozen from Bangladesh. So I think I'll stop there. There's a lot more to say about social changes, rural and urban, which are also sort of, you know, concerns about the loss of skills and so on. But I think it's quite a complicated picture, with both great interest in food and also social and environmental challenges, which, you know, seem to be threatening the inheritance of many traditions.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lucas. I guess the place I should begin is in introducing myself and some of the things that I do. I'm by far the least qualified person on this panel. I'm just a Hong Kong kid who's based in New York City, who opens these fast casual, cheap restaurants at the end of the day. And then sometimes I do events that in which we take ourselves way too seriously, and I get to cook for my friends and try to tell a story. As a Hong Kong sort of like transplant into New York and into the US, a recent immigrant of sorts, I think one of the things that I find the most exciting, having spent a little bit of time here in North America, is the idea of a future of Chinese food outside the borders of China that is colorful and vibrant and diverse and interesting, and certainly a huge part of how Chinese food develops. My personal sort of fortune is being Chinese and being a Chinese chef, in that I'm both Chinese and I make Chinese food. The lens through which I see the world is through Chinese cuisine. And it really feels like there is a certain magical malleability to Chinese cooking. It seems as if, via so many forces in history, Chinese food seems to have adapted to many sort of regions all over the world. But the things that I've been thinking the most about are in North America. So to tell you a little bit of a story about Nice Day, which is the new restaurant concept we're opening, the first real location isn't even open yet. It's basically a new type of Chinese takeout restaurant. The story goes something like, we were building our first concept, Junzi Kitchen, which is fast casual. My PR people hate it when I say Chinese Chipotle, but that's what it is. Chinese sweet green, build your own bowls, that sort of thing. It's for college students and young professionals and that sort of thing. It's delicious noodles, trin bing, and then salad bowls. But at Junzi, when we were building these new restaurants, we were building them from scratch. And as it normally goes, you find investors and you show them a pitch deck, and then you show them photos, and you say, this is what Chinese food used to be in the US, and this is what Chinese food is going to be. And the going to be is photos of the restaurant that we have. The photos of the restaurants that used to be in the US, right, that's the idea, are Chinese takeout restaurants. So if you're familiar, you can see them, right? The menu is a series of photos. It's printed out in the takeout sheet that's 100-something lines long. General Tso's chicken, lo mein, egg rolls, spring rolls, that sort of thing. It's cheap, it's delivered, and it's in large quantities and it's hot. And to be frank, the whole idea is that it wasn't that good, and it needed some sort of like evolution, right? That was the original thought. After a little bit of time, we stopped and we kept looking at that slide, and we asked ourselves, what in the world is actually going on with these old Chinese restaurants that we had assumed, as new immigrants building new restaurants, needed to phase out, right? So we do a little bit of digging. We go into Yelp and we figure out, we scrape off all of the data and try to figure out how many Chinese restaurants there are in the US, because it was last reported at something like 20 something thousand, but it really looks more like 46,000 Chinese restaurants. That is a lot. The usual statistic is it's a lot more than Burger King, Taco Bell's, and McDonald's combined or something. This is so much more than that. What's even crazier, the first time we got this data was in 2016. 46,000 is the number from 2019. We just ran the numbers again in 2021 at the end, and we're looking at 33,000 Chinese restaurants. That's around a third of restaurants closing that self-identify as Chinese. That's ridiculous. And this is not just a result of anti-Asian, don't go to Chinatown, don't eat Chinese food. This is some structural issue within the supply chain. And the reason why some of these Chinese restaurants are going away is a good thing. If these immigrants came to the US and they're opening these restaurants, they want their kids to go to law school and engineering school, and that's what they're doing. They're doctors, they don't no longer need to come back to the restaurant, that's a good thing. But then they have all these leases on their hands. They pass them, Cantonese people pass them off to Fujianese owners, and then suddenly they have a massive lease on their hands. Their livelihood is in their hands that they can't pass on. They're getting old, they can't hire. Food is getting more expensive. And if these restaurants close, the supply chain will start to tumble as well, because it's a massive, scaled, decentralized, diasporic network of restaurants. It's all sort of interconnected, and some people might describe it as a crisis. People might describe it as an evolution, but it's worth at least looking at, especially because the demand for Chinese food is going up, and the demand specifically for Chinese American takeout food is going up, especially during pandemic times when food is cheap, or people want food that is cheap. So the question is, how do we further the legacy of Chinese American takeout, keeping in mind the people that make it? And that's my primary interest. My primary interest isn't always just the food that these Chinese American places are serving, but the entrepreneurship that goes behind it. There are funny stories of reckless cultural appropriation, like the crab rangoon. The crab rangoon is a ridiculous dish. It's a deep fried cheese wonton. Doesn't make any sense to me. But also there is some sort of like, but as we talk about Web 3.0, we talk about a new type of like a paradigm for restaurants. I'm very excited about this idea that we have these ghost kitchen-ish type of decentralized restaurant that already exist in Chinese cuisine. So that's what we're working on at Nice Day. We're trying to involve the previous generation of owners into the new restaurants. There's a little bit of automation involved. There's a little bit of supply chain work involved. And I don't know, we're about to open our first restaurant, and this could all just be us sandbagging and making things up because we haven't done any of it yet. But that's sort of that's the energy, and that's what I'm constantly thinking about.
Everyone, I'm Xiaowei Wang, and I'm a writer. I write at the intersection of food and tech, and I'm super excited to be part of this today with two people whose work and contributions I very much admire. I guess I will just say, for me, I generally write about tech in the ways that it's shaping our sociocultural systems. But my book, Blockchain Chicken Farm, was about food because so much of it is deeply personal. My mom was a cafeteria worker who was always trying to sneak in her, Chinese cuisine touch, aunts and uncles working at those restaurants that Lucas just talked about. And so to me, it was just such a personal kind of drive to when I'm writing about technology in China that I wanted to look at it through the lens of food. And so throughout my research and book, I look at the ways that, new technologies are both enabling, some of these amazing small organic rice farmers in the countryside of China to actually sustain a business by selling on WeChat, by opening up their villages to things like organic rice farming tourism, and to also actually go against the grain of state control and the local agricultural bureaus. And at the same time, I think there is this kind of exciting way and opportunity in which these technologies and the ways that food changes to actually question notions of Chineseness and how Chineseness is constructed, the ways that, you know, we think about regional cuisine or ethnic minority cuisine, and the ways that this is, like, you know, disseminated throughout not just China, but also the world more broadly. One of the things, you know, actually parallels in my research when I started looking at food and tech in China was, you know, so much of tech and tech building, at least in the US or North America, it's very like masculine and male dominated. It's always like this, like the male engineer, the genius engineer, right? And for me, I was really moved to think about, you know, these home kitchen spaces, particularly, you know, throughout China, and the ways that those spaces were being changed by technology, and also like the production and supply chain networks. And just thinking about these gendered components of labor, and like in which spheres are labor like valued more. If it's like, you know, the home kitchen versus like the professional kitchen, and all these layers and nuances. So yeah, I'm super excited to dig in deeper, and yeah, especially talk about the ways that tech is also just reshaping like the ways that we eat, and also actually, you know, has a lot of I want to say assumptions about the ways that we make and produce, and like, you know, the physical labor behind food as well.
Thank you. I wonder if maybe we can pick up on, because there's so many things that each of you have brought into the conversation, I want to try and pick up on some of those threads and see if we can develop them further, and sort of get other kinds of insights into it. So I guess one place to start is maybe something that I see that actually all three of you share is a particular interest in the kinds of stories that you can tell with and through food. And I wonder actually, like, to what extent does that in and of itself sort of shape the way in which you think about the kinds of futures that are possible? And if, for example, the need to sort of bring a kind of storytelling or sort of narrative dimension, like how that sort of gives a particular slant, I guess, to the sorts of things that you prioritize, and the particular avenues that you see sort of really rich and fruitful in terms of how we should understand Chinese food and Chinese foodways.
My first thought is that so I do these dinners, right? Before the pandemic, there were tasting menus, and the format was always Chinese X blank, and whoever we were collaborating with would fill in the blank. It'd be Chinese Dominican food. If we were cooking with a Dominican chef, it might be Indo-Chinese food. If we're cooking with an Indian chef, but it could also be Chinese X, the color red, right? And the one wonderful thing about these dinners was, number one, we were serving it in our fast casual restaurant, as everyone else was getting these, like, you know, $10, $11 noodle bowls, and then we would have full plate settings, and people would eat this food, and so on and so forth. But also, the more wonderful thing is that after people left these dinners, they would think to themselves, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe Chinese Dominican food is like the most important thing I've ever thought about." And they'll think that to themselves for like 2 minutes. And food has a wonderful sort of ability to communicate those things, those narratives. But sometimes, and you know, one of the stories that I found myself telling over and over again is the story of the Detroit style corned beef egg roll, when we're thinking about regional cuisine, and we're thinking about Chinese American food as a regional Chinese cuisine, and we're thinking about Detroit style Chinese American food as a regional Chinese American cuisine. The Detroit egg roll, corned beef egg roll, is invented by a Vietnamese lady called Kim White, who was working in a Jewish deli, who stuffed an Irish style corned beef into a Chinese American takeout style egg roll, served with some type of like bang bang Thousand Island sauce that has nothing to do with any sort of island culture, but it's served to black and white blue collar Americans. And I mean, that the story in and of itself tells the story of how Chinese food can thrive and change within the United States. And even more wonderful is you realize that this sort of corned beef egg roll doesn't leave Detroit. It's a Detroit specific thing that was generated by somebody that was there, and it was infectious enough so that it's a part of the local culture now. I think it's powerful to use those narratives to start a conversation, because a lot of the times a powerful story is self-evident. But that's not the entire conversation, right? It starts a larger conversation about how did it get there. The corned beef egg roll example, for example, you can start tracing how Vietnamese people ended up in the Midwest, how Irish corned beef and pastrami ended up in Jewish delis, and so on and so forth. And I think that sort of is what I hope to do with narratives that you tell through food, is to ignite some sort of larger conversation and people's independent investigations into aspects of foodways and food history and whatnot.
I think in tech writing particularly, we always think of it as like a very not material thing. Like tech is the internet, and like you order stuff and somehow magically comes to your door, and you know, you use your phone to do stuff. And but I think for me, the narrative has to be actually challenged, that it's like not material. And so one very specific thing that I think about, you know, when I was researching Guizhou specifically, was that Guizhou has a lot of small farmers, and you know, this kind of chili pepper cuisine. It's also the epicenter of this big data industry. And so what was really interesting is that, you know, there was a lot of people, or a lot of, you know, decline in small farmers, both because of environmental degradation, but also because there was a lot of land actually being taken back by the state in order to embark on these big technical projects, like, you know, building giant data centers into karst mountains, these kind of greenhouse, precision agriculture, smart tech farming zones. And so I think that narrative, like bringing it back to remind us like that tech actually has this material footprint. You know, when you start using AI to do things like AI farming pigs, it will actually change the physical size of hog farms and actually have huge environmental impacts. And so I think, to me, having that like reminder that it literally will change the way you eat, like all of these things are connected, felt really important.
I think just following on from what Lucas was saying, very interesting about how dishes tell stories of their evolution. And it's very true in China as well. And a question that I keep getting asked sort of in interviews with Chinese journalists is like whether Chinese people should be worried about foreign influences and about, you know, for example, somebody asked me today about, you know, there was a fashion in Shanghai for Japanese omakase style banquet dining, and whether this was a threat to Chinese cuisine. And of course, if you look at the stories of Chinese cuisine, I mean, the chili I mentioned earlier, but it's all about exchange and evolution. And it's completely fascinating, for example, in North China, how you see the old footprint of the Silk Road in so many aspects of the cuisine. I mean, not least in pasta, which of course there's a flour milling came from the Western direction a very, very long time ago. But all these traditions of eating mutton in various forms with bread, with pasta, words like manta, which, you know, connects Chinese and East Asian languages through Turkic languages all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And then the more you look at sort of northern Chinese culinary traditions, you find things like, you know, versions of those sugary, syrupy Middle Eastern sweetmeats and halvas and so on. And food also tells the story of Chinese migration, and the fact that, you know, we think in modern terms sometimes about all these regional cuisines, but they're all the products of fusion. And for example, in Hangzhou, which is, you know, that was the southern Song capital. So when the northern invaders sacked the northern Song capital at Kaifeng, and the remnants of the dynasty moved south, and they've said that ever since you've had this tradition of Nan Liao Bei Peng, which is like southern ingredients cooked in a northern manner, and you get this sort of fascinating fusion of sort of versions of the, you know, what would be a sort of hot and sour soup in the north turning into a fish soup in the south, and then also like the xiaolongbao, which is called a mantou in some parts of this region, which again connects it up with all those Turkic foods from the north. And I think particularly if you look at Beijing, you know, so many of the most famous Beijing dishes are actually associated and invented by the Hui Muslims. So things like you know, a lot of the Peking duck restaurants, the Xuanyang roast, the scalded mutton and hot pot restaurants, a lot of those are halal Muslim restaurants. And the zhizi yang rou, the sort of griddled lamb, which is another dish which is clearly coming from the sort of, you know, the great nomadic traditions of the north. And so I think it's really interesting that even in the Chinese capital, it's really so multicultural. And so these stories are a sort of useful reminder of how dependent we all are on each other, and how actually Chinese cuisine has consistently for, you know, more than 2,000 years been enriched by trade and influences with the outside world.
I wonder if we can pick up further on this sort of, well, is there, do you think, a difference between cultural appropriation and fusion? Because it seems like, you know, going back to something that Lucas had said earlier about, you know, Chinese food as having this magical malleability. At what point, or do we need to identify a point? I mean, like where and how does cultural appropriation and fusion sort of work in sort of both either generating sort of new ways of sort of thinking about Chinese food or eating or sort of making Chinese food, but also maybe as sources or ways to preserve or protect or redefine what is Chinese? I don't know. I'm curious what you guys would say.
I mean, as we were saying, I think like all food is fusion food, right? Like we just have like that's just the way it is. Like all things influence each other, confluence produces things. But specifically when it comes to China, China's history is long enough, right? We found a freaking, I think it's like a 4,000-year-old noodle the other day, like sealed inside of an urn. It's like we've been making noodles before. Like the culinary history is so deep. China itself is so large. Its history is intriguing enough, and there's so much power involved that China obviously is a vortex for culinary influence, right? And the flip side of this coin, which I hear a lot, especially from Chinese chefs, is this sort of, and I'm totally making this term up, some sort of like neo-gastro colonialist like sort of like approach to saying all food is Chinese food. Vietnamese food is I literally heard someone say Vietnam, the Vietnamese cuisine, the regional cuisine of southern China. I was like, what are you talking about, right? Like because of how big of the history is, it's easy for us to like it's easy that we're lucky to use the lens to see all food through Chinese food, because there's a huge chance that there is some sort of like interaction at some point in history, as Fuchsia was saying. And perhaps I think sometimes when we're speaking in the English language, there's a bias, right? We're also speaking from the Western world, and we like to think of perhaps that we are speaking in English, and it means that the China is at its core to like some sort of foreign, which is to say that and therefore it needs to be ethic and monolithic, right? It needs to be traditional and can't really change. And it takes a little bit more mental gymnastics to think of the Chinese people that are in China today eating 3 times a day, and the fact that it's like changing on a constant basis for many people who are sort of thinking this way. I get really sort of, I think I had once sat on a panel when I was much younger saying all food is Chinese food. I bet I've said that before, because I was just lucky enough to think that way. But absolutely, I mean, that's where the appropriation, I think, starts sometimes, when you paint a far too simple of a picture of like how culinary influence comes. And then the fact of the matter, I think, my opinion is that it's a question of power, and it's like owning something that without sort of respecting the way it got there, and the other people who were doing it or doing versions of it before you.
And I always love, you know, when people make sort of sweeping statements about Chinese cuisine as if it was one cuisine that you could just sum up in a sentence, I always like to remind them that Chinese people make these appalling generalizations about Western food. Like the whole of Western food is 很简单, and then they are very simple, very monotonous. And it's really just a matter of where you're standing. But about the question of conservatism, there's one a brilliant Sichuanese chef, Lan Guijun, who actually is the first chef in Chengdu to get 2 Michelin stars recently. But I interviewed him for a piece a while ago, and he said something very brilliant. I can't remember the exact quote, but he basically said, I don't think we should be so conservative and keep droning on about the old great inventions of gunpowder and whatever. And I think that we should be open to new influences. And he said, you know, basically I'm Sichuanese, so whatever I cook is Sichuanese. And this is someone who is thoroughly grounded in local culinary technique. I mean, he's a master at all aspects of the Sichuanese traditional culinary arts, but he's totally open-minded and playful and inventive. And he spent some time in Japan. And his attitude, I think, is very healthy and inspiring. And I think also just that, you know, in some ways, you know, a culinary tradition, a cuisine, it is a state of mind. It's like, it's what you do with the ingredients that you have in front of you. So you can look in the fridge and you can approach it in a French way or a Sichuanese way or a, you know, Northern Chinese way. And what you would do is different. So like we can generalize a bit about, you know, Chinese cuisines in general. Like if you're going to cook food in a Chinese way, then probably one of the things you're going to do is cut it up in small pieces and sort of mix it up in some way and eat it with chopsticks, right? And you can do that with anything, you know, with any food stuff. You can cook it in that sort of way, which is a very essentially Chinese way. And the same with Sichuanese food, that, you know, Sichuan food is all about the artful mixing of flavors, combinations of flavors. And you can, one of the reasons I think that Sichuanese food travels so well and has become so internationally popular is that it's not about specific ingredients, really. It's about a sort of library of seasonings and a sort of structural approach to flavor. So it doesn't matter if the fish you're using is, you know, a British river reared trout. You know, if you put it in a chili bean sauce with ginger garlic, then you're making something that's kind of recognizably Sichuanese. So yeah, I think it's just that, you know, cuisines, it's like it's a set of ways of thinking about food often, which can be very, very malleable.
I think adding on to what both Fuchsia and Lucas have said, I think to me, appropriation. So there's this great artist, Astria Suparak, who actually has this piece that it's like a performance slash history piece that she does, and it's called Asian Futures Without Asians. And in it, she really unpacks like actually what like appropriation means, right? Is to have like notions of what Chinese or like what Asian is defined by people who are not Asian or Chinese. In this case, it was like Hollywood. And then also to like make money off of that representation, right? That kind of currency, that cultural language. And so I think to me, that's like the kind of line is it also comes back to the context of, I think, you know, there is a difference between like I'm a home cook and I cook food for my friends and that's it. And, you know, I touch upon like, you know, these like sourcing from my grocery store issues. But then at a different scale, like cooking becomes actually, you have to think about, yeah, like money and things like that. And so, you know, to me, the cultural appropriation part, I really think about that line that Astria brought up of like Asian futures without Asians. So like appropriation, it's like, you know, Chinese food without Chinese, or however you're calling like Chinese or whatever, but like without that kind of maybe thinking about it more broadly as like it is an industry, it has cultural currency and real currency attached to it.
Xiaowei, so Michelle actually has asked a question, and I think it actually builds up on what you've just been saying, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about how the adoption of tech is challenging notions of Chineseness. So, I mean, even just a moment ago, you sort of began by saying like, you know, Chinese food without Chinese people, however you define Chinese, but how do we define Chinese? And like, what role does tech play in terms of Chinese food and defining Chineseness?
Actually, I liked how you mentioned earlier, Lucas, like the word power and like this set of power relations. When I was thinking of sort of notions of Chineseness and tech, it's actually this very concrete example of a friend of mine, you know, there's all this kind of China-Africa relations, and a lot of it is built up around tech and tech infrastructure. And she, as like a tech ethnographer and researcher, she was saying that she was visiting Accra, Ghana, to like, kind of look at how big Chinese tech companies were actually, starting to pull in things like, mobile payment and all these like new, like long reach of Chinese tech industry there. And what surprised her was actually there was, she would go to Accra over the years and just notice actually like this new surge of like different mixes of Chinese cuisine on the ground, like using like the local version of like Sichuan, like fish or something like that. And so I think to me it's interesting, like I'm just was thinking about it from like this kind of tech as an industry angle.
So Charles Hayford writes, taking up on Fuchsia's comment, we know that many traditions were invented fairly recently and that the idea of 5,000-year-old Chinese tradition is more a political assertion than a historical fact. Lucas is talking about inventing new traditions, and I would say that the idea of authenticity, which is not even possible to define. So good, we can praise or dismiss food because it is or isn't traditional or authentic, but the opposites of these are interesting too. Trendy, fashionable, selling out, commercialized, confused, random, without soul. Is this a danger too? In what terms do we say that P.F. Chang's is less attractive than something?
Well, P.F. Chang's is really attractive. I think it's like it once upon a time was really attractive. If you put fried rice noodles underneath like a chicken lettuce cup, of course it's going to be delicious. Now we find it less delicious, but it was upon a time really interesting. The first time you have hoisin sauce, you're like, how could anything possibly be so balanced, right? Like I think the greatest, like we're lucky that we have these palates, and like we're lucky that there is this thing called deliciousness. And sometimes I find myself fretting and worrying a little bit too much. I'm sitting at a restaurant, I'm staring at this like fusion dish. I'm really worried that, all of Chinese cuisine has summed to this orange chicken wrapped inside of a scallion pancake. And I'm like, oh God, like the thing, this is over. But at the end of the day, the delicious stuff will prevail. And it seems to have in history. Of course, there are other factors as well. It's like, is it makeable? Like the sourcing of the ingredients, is this like labor-wise a good thing? But I just have a little bit of faith in things that taste good and resonate, right? And are sustainable in the broad sense of the word, are sustained throughout time. You can't call something a classic if we invented it a little while, like 2 days ago. It only becomes a classic like 30, 40, 50 years down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's actually rather amazing about Chinese food is that aside from all this change and dynamism and evolution, that some things really haven't changed for more than 2,000 years. And that, I find that amazing. So alongside the chili and all the modern fusion things, the fermented black beans, the ones that they found in the Ma Wangdui tombs in Hunan from, I think, the 3rd century BC, look exactly the same as the ones that you find in a Chinese supermarket today and are made by a similar method. And so China has this extraordinary mix of long continuities. And like this thing about the emphasis on cutting food into small pieces, certain, there are things that go back a long way, but have been used creatively and interwoven with all kinds of new influences. And that's one of the reasons that it's so fascinating. And I think too that, I think in your introduction, Wendy, to this talk, you mentioned the sort of emotional pull of the sort of anchoring of tradition. And we all need that. People feel nostalgia. They feel that, food is connected with place and with history and with heritage. And we need to feel that we're part of some tradition. But at the same time, in real life, people are mixing and matching all the time. And I think for me that, like I'm very opposed, I think it just doesn't work to be conservative about culinary traditions, to say that dishes and styles should be fossilized. It just doesn't work. But at the same time, I do have a lot of anxiety about the loss of skill and connectedness in Chinese cuisine. So there is something wonderful about food that is rooted in terroir, in local ingredients and traditions, and which has something very specific and creative that's related to the way people live and the sort of craft of food. And I think that, if we end up just eating food made in dark kitchens by anonymous, commercial chains, delivered on a bike, then there's a real sense of loss, and I find that, so, in Sichuan, for example, the bedrock of all the lovely Sichuan restaurant food that we love so much is, people cooking at home and a sort of real oral family tradition. And I think that, I mentioned a bit about all these social changes, like the hollowing out of villages in China, the migration of all the working age people, sort of breaking the chain of inheritance from the elderly to the younger generation. And then in cities, a lot of my friends, their parents are very skilled, not only cooks, but picklers and preservers. I mean, they just know so much about food and about, food cures and healthy eating. And then all the grandchildren are just forced to study hard all the time, and cooking is not seen as a sort of worthwhile, prestigious activity, strangely, considering how much Chinese people love food. And so there's, I think there's a role for encouraging the preservation of tradition as well as innovation.
Well, what do you think about, sorry, just to build on this, you mentioned something like breaking, like insofar as migrants moving into urban areas and like sort of families sort of breaking apart, and that potentially breaking sort of these chains of inheritance and learning tech skills and techniques and that kind of like inherited culinary knowledge. But then what role then does, for example, the government play? So like in terms of Chinese efforts to get UNESCO heritage, intangible heritage status, or the extent to which I think this also comes into Jose Lopez Gaonam's question about sort of, the Chinese government and sort of playing a kind of gatekeeping role in terms of what is in fact Chinese food or dishes and so forth. Like, is that a way to sort of protect tradition, or is it also a way to sort of move it forward?
Yeah, I think it's really mixed. So, I think that, I know people who are involved in the effort to do things like come up with a standardized recipe for mapo tofu and to actually sort of list it and make that the official version. And in one sense, it's really admirable because they're trying to document things that may be lost or changing very fast. But at the same time, in real life, everybody makes mapo tofu slightly differently. It's part of a living culture. And so, the artifact of an absolutely measured, fixed recipe, it's not, a recipe is not something really absolute like that. And I think that, so these, there are certainly, things like in the past, in the 80s and 90s, there was a huge effort to document regional cuisines and to, write all these regional cookbooks. And they do have some value, and they're sort of records of cuisine at that time. But I would say that anecdotally, the story that I hear all over China from everyone all the time is of loss of skills. I've met so many artisans who have no one to pass on their skills to. I know absolutely exceptional chefs in China who cannot find apprentices who are willing to apply themselves to learn from these masters. And so there are kinds of food like, there are kinds of food that are disappearing because younger people don't want to learn. They want different sort of lifestyles. As the older generation complain, they don't want to 吃苦, they don't want to eat bitterness. They're too lazy. They just want easy lives. But yeah, so there is this real sense of loss. But I should say some little bits of hope that with this renewal of interest in food as heritage and culture, I have met some very interesting, actually, young women who've gone back to their small hometowns to take over traditional businesses of making, in one case, the pidan, the preserved duck eggs, and in another case, to make the fermented tofu. One of them was actually educated abroad in the United States. So that was a really radical thing for a young woman educated abroad to go back to a small town and carry on the family business. So, yeah, I just hope that the kind of renewed interest in different lifestyles and food will be in time to save some of these skills from being lost.
I just want to add really quickly to is that one thing that I talk about a lot with one of my food writer friends is that so much of like modern recipes, like the exact amount, this is how you do things exactly. It's like, you know, also reflective of this kind of globalized, industrialized world that we live in, right? Because it's like, well, actually, like, you know, under food scarcity, it's like, well, add a handful of that. Maybe you don't have that ingredient. Okay, like, you know, add a little bit of this. And so it does like change and shift too with like the broader context.
Lucas, I apologize. I cut you off a moment ago.
No, I actually wanted to. Last time we spoke, Fuchsia lamented the massive explosion of hot pot restaurants that I thought was so interesting, because we all love hot pot, right? It's like of course we love hot pot, like everywhere around the world, right? Here in the U.S., so the biggest growing market segment within Chinese food and so on and so forth. But what Fuchsia was saying, and I don't to take it, but it's like, at the end, I had forgotten that we don't cook hot pot.
Yeah. I'm saying I actually in my notes for my introduction, which I completely forgot to say, I actually used the word hot potization of Chinese cuisine, and by which I mean that, and this is another thing, that, you know, wok cookery is so very difficult and sensitive and individual, and like when I see an accomplished wok chef producing dish after dish after dish, I just kind of worship. I just think it's an incredible kind of kung fu. It's like an art. It's just a beautiful art, and it's very, you know, the training to become an accomplished wok chef is hard, and you have to be absolutely on the ball all the time, because it's a matter of split-second timing and judgment and so on, and so it's very difficult to find good wok chefs, and it's difficult, you know, it's a hard training. And so the easy solution, if you want to make money of a restaurateur, is to have a hot pot restaurant, and you have one master chef who comes up with an absolutely irresistible broth, right? And then all you need is low skilled workers to slice up a lot of food, and the guests do their own cooking. And so you know, I don't want to be down on hot pot because I know it's so popular, but it's really when I see how many hot pot restaurants there are in China, and it's happening too in London as well. You know, it's much easier for people to have a hot pot restaurant, you know, and it's sociable. So you get that side of the food, but it's not really an expression of the absolutely dazzling brilliance of Chinese culinary arts, in my opinion.
Yeah. If we zoom out to beyond China, also, like, there's loss of skill. I think there are two sides to this. There's like an optimistic side and a pessimistic side. First, the pessimistic side. I was a couple of years ago, I was hanging out with Philip Chang, because I know P.F. Chang's came up. He's the founder of P.F. Chang's. And he talked about his opening chef for P.F. Chang's, who then went on to open Panda, actually. He used to work for Cecilia at the Mandarin. And talked about the chef being the type of Cantonese chef that would make stir fries, but he would be the only person in the kitchen that could wok cook silently. Anybody who's like cooked on a professional wok knows that, like, the roar of the flame, and then this is like clanging that's gotten to do with you not knowing exactly where the rim of your wok is, and it bouncing up and down and that sort of thing. But he would like cook silently, you know, and which is to say, P.F. Chang's used to be delicious because it was like one of the first restaurants to introduce walking cooking everywhere in the world. Of course, you know, over time things have changed, ingredient sourcing has changed, and it is by no means Philip doesn't even work at P.F. Chang's anymore, but it's by no means a derivative of the Mandarin in San Francisco, as in its current iteration. The optimistic side is I actually just spent about a month cooking in Toronto. And for the first time ever in North America, I was R&Ding and cooking with some chefs at a Chinese Canadian restaurant. It's been open for 25 years. A story that you might have heard before. You know, parents open the restaurant, son went to business school, comes back, takes over, starts a market, changes the branding a little bit. But the difference is, this is midnight inside of a Cantonese kitchen at the back, and I'm watching these literal 18-year-olds to 22-year-old college students learning to flip the wok from these old school chefs who came over from Fujian and from southern China. And there is some magical combination of the cult of the North American celebrity chef, plus this, like, these really skilled cooks who have left during their lifetime southern China and have ended up in Toronto, and they're cooking really wonderful, like, wok cooking dishes and teaching it to young kids that I'd never seen before. I'd never seen it in China. Every time I cook there, the cooks spend most of the first week trying to get me out of the kitchen. They're like, I don't know why you're here. I don't know why you would want to learn any of this stuff. Same thing in anywhere in North America. Like I've never seen young cooks, like young Chinese cooks who went to college and went to school and so on and so forth, really want to learn the cuisine. So there is a little bit of a glimmer of hope for the future of like culinary technique being handed down and passed down to North American born Chinese cooks, I think, maybe.
That's very interesting.
Actually, it's funny that you mentioned that because James Farrer had actually asked a question about with the decline of working class migration from China to the U.S., for example. His question was, how is the mix of labor in Chinese American kitchens changing? And are there more non-Chinese cooks and other kitchen workers? Would this be a long-term influence on the cuisine?
I think, well, my kitchen, I almost don't have any Chinese cooks in my kitchen, but we've gone to great lengths to, it's boring stuff that nobody likes to talk about, but it's standardization and then creating documents and, employee manuals and training procedures to go the extra length to teach somebody who not only didn't come to the kitchen cooking Chinese food, but didn't grow up eating Chinese food. So they're missing a reference point also. I think it's important, and it falls on this generation of chefs to do that education, because otherwise it'll be lost. I wouldn't say that, I mean, if it's a question of comparing rates of change, I think we're losing a lot more talent than we're gaining, certainly. Just as almost everywhere else in the world in terms of traditional cooking. So yeah, nothing good to report on that front, but we're doing our best.
There's a few different questions that have come up about Chinese food and sustainability, as well as sort of the rise of alternative, like meat alternatives. So for each of you, like, what do you think in terms of sustainability? How should Chinese food, broadly construed, move forward, and what role does alternative meat or non-meat meat play in this mix?
I mean,
I'm not super familiar. I grew up eating the Buddhist stuff. And I've always thought that I keep reading about Impossible Meat and Beyond Burger and whatnot, trying to make big moves in China, and I always feel like they're missing the point by glossing over the massive meat substitute, not just vegetarian or vegan cooking, but like meat substitute technology, right, so to speak, that we have for manipulating things like soybeans and mung beans. I have noticed. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I think you're right when it comes to sort of American, or I guess like Western companies who are engaged in meat alternatives, but like something like Omni Meat, which is actually I think originally is out of Hong Kong.
Yeah, it is.
And I think there was a piece that was written up about them like a year or two ago, and I think one of the things that they emphasize is that the Chinese market is very particular about taste, and so when they were doing their sort of meat research development, as it were, like they were thinking really carefully, not about how do we make an alternative meat patty like that you put in a hamburger, but like all the different ways, all the different kinds of textures that are associated with pork, for example, that go into a variety of different sorts of dishes. And so it does seem like at least one possibility, at least for some of these companies that are coming up, is actually to treat a Chinese palate as fertile ground for innovation in and of itself, right? So rather than assuming that there is a model coming from the US, but to really sort of play with and explore what's happening in terms of local eating patterns and so forth.
I work with Omni, and Omni makes, this is not a plug, but it sort of is. Omni makes Spam. They make luncheon meat, and it is so good, and it's so it's totally indistinguishable from the regular stuff. I mean, I hate that indistinguishable is the mark of quality for these things, but yeah, that's a good point, right? Like they went straight for the luncheon meat as something in Hong Kong, especially that there is a market for, and I cannot imagine Impossible doing that first in North America.
I mean, one thing is that I think it's quite stunning how little recognition there is internationally that the Chinese were onto the imitation meat thing about 1,000 years before Americans, and that, you know, China has this really remarkable tradition of inventiveness with creating meat and fish substitutes, which of course were associated with Buddhist monasteries, which were entertaining, you know, patrons and visitors to feasts. And I think what's also really interesting, there's a lot of criticism for some of the vegan foods in the West now, that they're basically junk food. You know, they're highly processed and full of additives. But in China, particularly in the Jiangnan region, for example, you have vegetarian ham, chicken, vegetarian roast duck, vegetarian crab meat, which are all brilliantly engineered to mimic the appearance and the taste and the textures of the things that they're pretending to be. But they're made from normal, wholesome ingredients like just tofu and soy sauce and Shaoxing wine and so on. So I think that, you know, I think that, you know, I would hope that people in the West who want to eat healthily and want to eat less meat would learn a bit from China instead of kind of just reinventing the wheel, because there is this very rich tradition. But the other thing is that, more importantly, and I've written quite a lot about this, that I think Chinese cuisine offers many solutions for our predicament, environmental predicament, just in the way that people traditionally eat, which is to say that instead of having one, you know, a steak or a slab of pork that would feed one American, can be sliced up and stir fried with vegetables to feed a family with some other vegetable dishes. And I think the thing that is, I think that, you know, people in the West often associate or have associated the idea of trying to eat less meat as with deprivation and kind of loss, like, and it is a loss if your tradition is having, you know, half a chicken on your plate or a whole steak, then having vegetables, you know, they're just the side dishes, right, in a lot of Western views. But in China, you have this cuisine which traditionally makes the most of vegetables and cooks meat with vegetables, use small amounts of meat and stock and lard to bring savor to a lot of vegetables. So the thing that's so incredible with Chinese cuisine, and also it's a real culture of gastronomy, of the pursuit of pleasure in food. So with Chinese food, you can, I mean, like a dish like mapo tofu, I mean, there's a very small amount of meat, it's mostly soybean, and it's so insanely delicious that most people find it very satisfying. And there are so many Chinese dishes like that. So I think rather than just thinking that we have to go on putting a big slab of something like meat at the center, we can rethink the way we eat and borrow from this idea of using meat more as a flavoring principle.
And I'll just quickly add that I think a lot of the narratives of like, oh, there's more Chinese people eating more meat, that kind of sustainability concern or narrative, I think per capita, like Chinese people in China actually eat far less meat than the regular American. And additionally to that, it's like, yes, there is the part of like our kind of personal or like cultural habits, but there's also the, you know, that fact that these are all like, you know, businesses, and, you know, the meat industry makes money and they want people to eat meat. And actually, you know, so much of the alternative meat stuff, part of it is like, well, you know, eventually, like with enough capital, they'd probably get enough people to eat alternative meat.
Do you think that, I mean, Xiaowei, do you think tech is kind of the solution to solving some of the sustainability issues for China? I mean, the government certainly is spending a lot of money in terms of different sorts of agricultural technologies, whether it's, or also in terms of just like large scale husbandry is also like really technologically mediated. I mean, is this a way to sort of solve some of those ecological and sustainability issues that they are encountering?
I think oftentimes tech is used in these cases, particularly industrial farming cases. And so, you know, as I personally am very concerned with industrialized, like big scale farming. And so I think also we tend to use tech as like this blanket solution to what is actually a deeper social and cultural and environmental issue that stems from deeper state policies. And I think a lot of the money that's spent on these, you know, multi-million-dollar contracts for Alibaba and like its AI farming could actually be used like towards, you know, small farmers or like subsidies or things like, you know, just actually supporting people who are already doing the work. But of course, you know, I think that how it ends up in policy is like less clear cut.
So we're sort of nearing the end of our time, although obviously we could continue quite into the very late night, especially for you, Fuchsia. But we have the question I think that might be worth sort of picking at in this last little bit is from Azul Ruker. He asks, or she asks, or they asks, what role do you think the internet plays in the evolution of Chinese cuisine? Because the internet inspires people with an increased awareness of different cuisine at such a great speed, will it be harder to keep up with, especially on an academic level?
As Fuchsia, you were saying the hot potization, it reminded me of like how TikTok works and how it's like there's no like, it's like everyone can cook their own food, everyone can upload a video now. But one thing that at least I've really appreciated is actually seeing a lot of like cooking live stream in China, particularly on the app Xia Chufang, where you can actually just like for, you know, a couple of renminbi, like very little money, you know, see someone in their kitchen, like explain to you the complex you know, things to do if you're wanting to like make like shuizhuyu or something like that. And that's been like super cool to just see all these home chefs, home cooks actually teach you these techniques. And I think a particularly interesting, I don't know, direction.
I mean, I think also just in sort of documenting culinary traditions and spreading culinary knowledge, the sort of the internet has been so important, and not just, you know, for Chinese people within China in a Chinese language community, but also increasingly foreigners, people abroad are learning about Chinese food traditions from videos. And I think that that's, you know, one of the things that I was going to talk about at the beginning, I didn't have time, was just about how perceptions of Chinese food are changing internationally. And I think there's a growing recognition of its diversity. You know, gone is that idea that Chinese cuisine is something that everyone already knows and it's based on a sort of anglicized Cantonese menu. You know, people can just go and watch. Somebody just mentioned Chef Wang Gang, you know, cooking Sichuanese food in Sichuan. And that's really changing. I have to tell you a really funny story that I was in Yunnan just before the lockdown, and I ate this amazing local food in Sichuanbanna, and it looks like a bunch of grass stalks or bamboo shoots, and it's put on the table, and you basically open them up, and inside each one there's a long yellow worm, and you can eat them raw or cooked, and you eat it, and it tastes like sweet corn. But anyway, so it looks like a bunch of grasses, and it was a really extraordinary food. And I was trying to shock and amaze my young nephew. And so I showed him a photograph of the bundle of grasses. And I said, God, guess what that was? And he knew because he'd seen it on TikTok. He said, oh, yeah, it's that grass that you open and there's a worm in it. And it's like, you know, this is a little boy in Oxford. And I just, you know, quite amazing.
Is TikTok the new source of culinary
yeah, there's TikTok, but there's also like Xiaohongshu and all these other like Chinese social media apps. Like Xiaohongshu is really funny because for a while I was just watching all these like Chinese students in the US use like ready to go Trader Joe's products to approximate Chinese dishes. Like, you know, everyone's using like the pre-made pizza dough to make different like yeasted bows and stuff, and using the Sonoran handmade flour tortillas as being. And at first I was like, this is exactly what, you know, Panda Express is doing, you know, like, or every other Chinese restaurant where they ran out of, they didn't make their own chumbing or whatever. And so for Mushu Park, they just used flour tortillas. And like big circle, we're back at it. And some of it is sort of funny and comedic, but, you know, people are always going to use the internet in resourceful ways.
Okay, well, we'll stop there. Obviously, this is a conversation that should and hopefully will continue in other ways. Thank you again to everyone who's come and joined us tonight. I want to express my thanks to Fuchsia and Lucas and Xiaowei, and I hope that I hope everyone has a good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.